matters that will be of interest and relevance given it's ANZAC Day this week. It's good to be home, and we had Cabinet today and Cabinet Business Committee to rattle through a few things for the week ahead. On Wednesday, ANZAC Day, I will be at the dawn service in Auckland at the War Memorial Museum, and then we'll be visiting the Mount Albert RSA. I'll also drop in on the Greylin RSC and the Point Chevalier RSA. We will also have government representation at the National Memorial and National Service by Ministers Little and Robertson. Thursday and Friday I'll be busy with various bits and pieces and stakeholder meetings in Auckland. It's been brought to my attention that it is essentially our 6-month anniversary. Thank you for your cards and acknowledgements. I've had a number of questions about the first 6 months that we've had in office, and so I thought I might use this opportunity to give you some of the highlights. The lowlights I'll spend less time on. First of all, probably the families package for me is a real standout. Legislation that we put through in our first mini budget, which will give effect to families, low and middle income families on average being $75 a week better off. Also the introduction of the Best Start payment, which is $60 per week per child, and also the winter energy payment. And all will be some of the most substantial changes that we'll see in a decade for young children and families and older citizens. We also had the increase in paid parental leave to 26 weeks, the introduction of child poverty legislation, which is tracking well, as is the child wellbeing strategy, the inquiry into the abuse of children in state care, which is underway as of the 1st of February, and the work, of course, that we did around students and those seeking to pursue education post-secondary school. The minimum wage increased to $16.50 an hour as well. We've begun work on climate change, and that includes our 30-year transition plan and setting our zero carbon emissions goal and the interim climate commission. In terms of our regions, it's an area I want to put particular emphasis on. The Provincial Growth Fund of $1 billion is well underway, and announcements have been starting to be made across the country, and we of course continue to seek the views of regions around the areas that they would like to prioritise investment. Equally, our government policy statement on transport places priority on our local and regional roads, and the 1 Billion Trees program, with the first tree being officially planted in Gisborne. Around housing, the Unitec land sale was significant, allowing the building of about 3,000 affordable public homes, with the Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill, and the work we're doing on banning overseas speculators in our residential housing market, and of course the directive to Housing New Zealand to stop the large-scale sell-off of state houses. I'm going to finish with just a little bit on our trade agenda as well, because in its totality, that too has been busy and is an important part of this government's agenda. We had, of course, the signing of the CPTPP. We're making good progress, particularly, I would say, more confident now than I've been before on progressing our EU FTA. The UK FTA, we remain hopeful that we will be a front runner in the aftermath of Brexit. Talks are underway on the upgrade of the FTA with China. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, that's a 16-country agreement. That one gives us the opportunity to at least seek an agreement which involves India, given that our one-on-one FTA has taken significant time to progress. There's the Pacific Alliance, which is also under negotiation, PACER Plus, which will be ratified by Parliament soon, and of course our Trade for All agenda, which was launched not last week but the week prior. So that's a quick summary of the highlights. I want to speak briefly now to something that is relevant for ANZAC Day, and that is the support that we provide our veterans and the growing acknowledgement of the stress and the post-traumatic stress that veterans have experienced for decades, but is only in recent years really being acknowledged and remedied. The previous Labour New Zealand First Coalition government provided a locked-in annual grant for the RSA in that regard, but it was scrapped by the last national government and instead was replaced by ad hoc funding out of underspend. Earlier this year we made a decision and gave the RSA and the No Duff Charitable Trust, who support veterans, a one-off grant of $250,000 and $25,000 respectively. Today though, we're announcing, alongside our Minister Ron Mark, that we're locking that funding in for the next 4 years. This will provide the RSA and No Duff with an ability to better plan for their veterans' support, because we are giving them certainty over the next 4 years. In total, it represents $1.1 million in guaranteed funding to these non-government agencies who do such critical work with our veterans. I understand that Minister Mark has contacted both the RSA and No Duff this afternoon to let them know the news, and both organisations were thankful for the funding and recognise the support that this government is eager to place around our veterans. It's an acknowledgement of the importance as well of those support services. We now have 41,000 veterans. Around 30,000 of those are contemporary veterans from conflicts such as Vietnam, East Timor and Afghanistan. And we are seeing cases of post-traumatic stress, and many of our younger men and women are returning from operational service and do require our help and our assistance. I'm really impressed by the work the RSA has done to modernise its services to meet some of those changing and emerging needs, and I hope that this support and funding also goes some way to backing them. All right, happy to take questions.
On that RSA funding, $250,000 a year doesn't sound like a lot. What will that provide?
And that will go directly to the services that RSA provides, and in some cases some of that may be unique to the particular veterans that they're working with, but my expectation would be that it would be dealing directly with those needs around post-traumatic stress. They've already identified what makes a difference for their veterans, and my expectation is that it will continue the work in the service they do around post-traumatic stress.
On your trip, was the biggest diplomatic win getting Macron on board with the FTA?
Certainly that was, I'd be fair to say that was my primary goal in many ways for this trip to Europe. Two-way trade with the EU is worth about $15 billion. It is significant. It is an area where there has been concerns raised in the past about whether or not our mandate would come through in May. And look, I'm not counting our chickens before they hatch. There is some work still yet to be done. But to have had such a positive response from President Macron definitely caused me to come away feeling really positive about our position, much more so than I perhaps did prior.
And was it New Zealand's environmental credentials? Did that help at all, do you think?
Do you know, certainly the sense that I got, both publicly and privately, was that there was a real interest in embedding into our agreements some of the domestic priorities into an international framework. There had been some concern with previous agreements that hadn't happened, and it perhaps undermined some of the work that they were trying to promote internationally. So I think the reassurance around our inclusive and progressive trade agenda, around saying these are tools we can use to uphold environmental protections, was probably a selling point.
So are you confident that France will support comprehensive negotiations and that it's not going to say some aspects of agriculture cannot even be negotiated?
Look, I came away with the sense that we would be able to see support from their corner on that agreement. Again, I'm not going to preempt that final decision, and we aren't taking anything for granted. We'll continue to work alongside a range of EU members who may have issues, particularly around agriculture. But it wasn't an issue that the President raised with me, and in fact when he was asked about concerns from a French journalist in that regard, he spoke instead for his desire to embed environmental protections in the agreement and how positive he viewed some of our expectations in that regard.
Prime Minister, back on ANZAC Day, briefly, with 2018 marking the century since the end of the war, ask you just to reflect on what makes this year important?
Yeah, I think, to be fair, from what I've seen of the New Zealand public, over the last few years, increasingly there's been that engagement of the next generation again. And I think that we should feel confident that that will only continue. Of course, this milestone is significant. It marks an incredible period of time since New Zealand experienced both that huge contribution and huge loss. It will be bookended by events at the end of the year as well. What I hope is that it's laid a foundation for another generation to appreciate the sacrifices that were made and the work we all collectively need to do to avoid such tragic loss in the future.
Have you put any thought into whether you're going yourself or sending someone to that commemorations in November?
Yes, and we are giving it some consideration. Final decisions haven't been made yet, though.
Why did you make the call not to attend the national celebration down here?
Yeah, and that is a line call, and I had a few conversations about it. There is a national service, absolutely, in Wellington, but equally there's one of huge size and participation that happens in Auckland. I wanted to make sure we were represented at the highest level at each of these. So we've got the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and Andrew Little and Grant Robertson all playing a role in some of those ones based in Wellington, and myself covering Auckland.
You said this morning that there needed to be a huge culture change
Yes.
at work and income.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
I have seen too many stories as an MP in my local area which demonstrate that decisions have been made that haven't taken into account the human side of some of the cases at play. For instance, someone who didn't realise that they had an appointment, who subsequently had their benefit cut off, who went in to seek another appointment immediately to try and rectify the situation, only to be told the books were full and they'd have to come back in several weeks. These kinds of decisions have huge ramifications for people and their lives, and what we need to do is make sure that we have a service that really puts people at the centre, that yes is comprehensive, of course make sure that we're following all of the expectations that we have as a government, but ultimately treats people respectfully.
As part of your confidence and supply agreement with the Greens, you promised an overhaul of the system. When can we expect to see that starting?
It's imminent. So Minister Carmel Sepuloni will be making announcements on that, and it's not too far away.
Before the
Is
budget.
that the abolishing of the state change?
That's certainly one of the things that has been raised, and I see actually it's been raised recently by the UN, who have been doing a review on human rights issues. And that's something that we flagged, of course, in our conversations directly with the New Zealand Green Party. So that's only one of many issues that, of course, we need to look at.
Is this something that's going to be dealt with in the budget process or before then?
Look, I'm not going to set out the exact timeline of that announcement, but it is imminent.
Why the delay? Given that was one of the promises he made was getting.
Because it is one of many, and I think that there are much wider issues. That's not the only one, it is one of them. And we absolutely acknowledge that, but there are many issues around culture change generally that we want to be part of a wider piece of work.
Do you credit Materia today for bringing some of the bigger, meatier issues with work and income?
I think if you ask any member of parliament who works across an electorate, they will be able to share a story where it just has not made sense to them, the treatment that they've seen in individual experience. And so, yes, some have had higher profile than others, but the stories that have always, I think, probably captured me the most have been the ones that have been told to me face to face by people who have just sought out help when they needed it and had pretty terrible experience. I do want to acknowledge though that by and large many case managers do an exceptional job, but there are situations where you're just left wondering why there just wasn't the respect shown that should have been.
Just back on trade real quick.
Work and income need more resources. Is that problematic?
Oh look, when we're undertaking this overhaul and this work on both culture change and some elements of the benefit system, I'd expect that all of the contributing factors will be part of that.
Is this going to take longer than you might have thought?
Sorry?
Is this taking longer than you might have hoped?
We want to make sure that we get it right. It is a substantial piece of work, and culture change is difficult. We're coming in after 9 years of there being an expectation that there'll be a singular focus on reducing benefit numbers, and of course we want people in work. We want people who are seeking work to be able to find work. But I think it's tipped over into a space where it's actually denying people who need help the help they need.
Just back on trade real quick, you've talked in the past about New Zealand trying to get an exemption from steel and aluminium tariffs in the US. Have you got any update on where that's at?
No, not as yet. We know some of the exemptions that were granted were temporary exemptions, and from memory that was taking them into May. But as yet, I haven't heard final word from New Zealand's perspective.
Are you disappointed that it's taken this long?
Well, I'm disappointed that it happened in the first place. I don't think anyone benefits from that kind of trade policy. I think the people who end up worse off do include countries like New Zealand as a result, even though relative to some of the others we're a smaller player in those markets, but ultimately I'm disappointed we're in this position in the first place.
Just on Middlemore Hospital, 12 days ago the Minister of Health sent letters to 2 board members of Counties Manukau District Health Board saying that they were being removed from the board. Do you think it's acceptable that almost 2 weeks later the Health Minister is still responding to media queries saying that that process is still underway?
Well, he may be answering in that way because it is. Obviously, that's a process that I have faith and confidence that the Minister of Health is handling. Of course, board appointments do have to go through particular processes, so I won't comment on that until that's complete.
Did your government overblow the issues at Middlemore Hospital? It's been reported that the sewage leaks were just stains on the floor that could be cleaned up with water.
Of course, originally those claims were more often than not coming from Counties Manukau themselves. And the reports that we received, of course, when it was first raised with us, were about one particular part of the hospital, and that they were serious enough that we came away and immediately granted funding to try and do remedial work on that. The other issues are ones that were raised not necessarily by us, but directly in the media.
Do you think it's acceptable though for the Health Minister to terminate the contract of a board member who he has never met with, never spoken to, and never had any correspondence with, other than a letter to say we're considering removing you, and another letter to say that he's gone?
Well, look, again, I'm not going to comment on something that's still underway, but I would point out that I'm assuming this is a reference to the acting chair. The acting chair was in place till the beginning of May, and that's an expectation that obviously was set out from the beginning. And of course, the Minister will need to make sure that there's clarity around who will be taking over that role before that contract expires.
It's not in regards to the acting chair, it's in regards to the other board member that he's chosen to terminate the contract of, who he's never had any dealings with.
Again, this is an issue that is still underway, and I'm not going to comment on correspondence that is still part of a process that hasn't been finalised. I'm sorry that you didn't make it as well.
I'm a permanent resident here, so I'm happy. On spousal travel abroad, John Key had a rule in his government that spouses wouldn't travel with ministers unless absolutely necessary. What's your view on spousal travel?
Yeah, and this is something I've given some consideration to as well. I've looked back at, for instance, what the practice has been for particular events like Chogam, and have been advised that in those cases, I think at least for the last 2 Prime Ministers, Prime Minister English and Key, that those spouses have accompanied the Prime Minister, because there's often a decision made that where there is a particular spousal program, that's when we've seen cases of spouses travelling with their partners. I again take a similar view. There has to be a threshold met for spousal travel, and those guidelines are set out in Cabinet circulars.
What about not just Prime Minister, other ministers?
Yeah, again, I would want a strong, clear case. More often than not, you see when spouses are accompanied, more often than not, those are covered by the minister themselves at their own personal cost.
A few weeks ago, you were highlighting the infrastructure deficit that you uncovered when you came into government, and you said you'd have updates for us in due course. Are there any more things that you found out in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I do have some expectation that ministers in their own portfolio areas will be talking about that a bit more in the lead up to the budget.
But you haven't got any for us today now?
I've spoken generally, for instance, about some of the deficits we've seen in health and education. There was some discussion around deficits for early childhood education, underfunding in those areas, but again, you'll see more of that as we lead up to the budget. One of the issues is, of course, the second question, as soon as we identify them, is what are you doing about it? And we're not in a position to discuss some of the budget responses quite yet.
And just on infrastructure, ANZ said yesterday that it thinks an argument can be made for increasing near-term debt targeting for the purpose of growth-enhancing infrastructure spending. So essentially looking at your debt responsibilities and saying there's an argument to be made about spending more on infrastructure rather than...
And we are. Relative to the last government, we have put aside more capital There is a greater allowance for capital than the last government put forward. So there is greater investment going into that area than was previously budgeted for.
But are you concerned that New Zealand's biggest bank is making noise about the fact that they think that you should be borrowing more to cover these infrastructure costs?
They haven't as yet seen the decisions that we've made in this budget, so happy to revisit that once they've seen those decisions.
Just on the decision to ban oil and gas, did you take a completely evidence-based approach to forming that policy?
Yes, of course, evidence-based requires some knowledge and prediction around the future. Of course, because in this decision we weren't cancelling anything that already existed, then the analysis becomes making judgments around things that we cannot be sure of. For instance, my last block offer, my understanding resulted in one permit. You can never ever be sure that that permit will then be realised into an actual oil or gas fine. It's a highly predicted, difficult to predict area, and that makes cost-benefit analysis very difficult as well.
Yeah, because the ministers admitted there was no cost-benefit analysis done, there was no formal consultation with the industry done, there were no estimates of how it would actually contribute to lowering emissions, and there was no estimates on how it would affect.
I would question the discussion with the industry. The minister was very familiar, given the number of times she'd met with them, over their view on this issue more generally. And of course we flagged well before the election that we didn't see a future for oil and gas exploration in New Zealand. The decision that we've made will not really come into full effect for the next until 30 years. And so you're asking for us to predict around something that was not being granted, rather than making any changes to the existing industry as it stands. Every permit held today remains in place and is unaffected by this decision.
Would you expect any other government policy to have those four things stacking up against it in terms of...
I question some of the things you're saying that we haven't done in that place. And the other thing that I would highlight is that this is a regulatory decision. It's heavily prescribed by the Crown Minerals Act. That was what the Minister followed in making the decision. And again, as I would say, whether or not any of those oil and gas reserves would ever have been quantifiably contributed to royalties to the government is very difficult to predict. What we can predict is that there are more than 50 permits out there now. They all remain in place, and there's no loss and therefore no cost from those no longer being continued.
Prime Minister, you also flagged before you went to Europe that you were going to go to Taranaki yourself.
I am.
With Megan Woods,
yes.
Soon after you came back. She went yesterday.
I said in the weeks after I return. I looked at whether or not I can get there in the next couple of weeks. At the moment I'm scheduled in for the 25th, I believe, of May. I'm looking at whether or not I can get there earlier than that. There are some people I wish to take with me, but I am absolutely going to Taranaki. I have no concern about visiting the region and talking openly with them about plans for regional economic development.
Prime Minister, on the benefits, MSD have said that the Tinder case was a one-off mistake and that this is not the culture. Are you disagreeing with them? Do you think there's a wider these mistakes happen?
I would hope it was a one-off. Am I certain and confident? No. I've seen enough of these cases and examples in the past, and I am, of course, Heart Network and Income has come out straight away, apologised and said that they should never have cancelled someone's benefit without properly undertaking an investigation. But can I hand on heart say this will be the only example? No.
6 months on from taking on the Prime Ministerialship, with a moment to reflect, how are you doing?
Oh, just not much time for reflection, I have to say. But when I look at the work that we've done so far, and the things that we've focused on, which have been priorities around regional economic development, around getting our transport back into shape, around issues of the environment, and making sure we acknowledge that middle-income New Zealanders are feeling the squeeze and getting something in place for them. I'm proud of that. We've done a lot in a short space of time.
Do you think your profile and the profile of New Zealand's been raised a lot over the last week?
I mean, it's quite hard for me to assess. To be fair, I don't sit down and do too much analysis of international media. But there's no doubt that one of the jobs in going abroad for me, first and foremost, was pursuing things like that EU FTA that is of tangible benefit to New Zealand. What's less tangible, but probably of importance as well, is making sure that people know about the values we're trying to progress on the international stage. And they are things like free and fair trade, making sure that we all apply the rules of international order, and our position on environmental issues.
Do you ever worry that you might be more popular overseas than you are back home?
I'm only focused on back home in that regard. It is of no value or benefit to me if I'm popular in the UK. I need to focus on domestic issues and domestic politics and making sure I satisfy New Zealand voters. The rest is immaterial.
Prime Minister, the Royal Commission into the banking sector over in Australia is uncovering some pretty dodgy practices in the Big Four. Given that the Australian banks are essentially New Zealand's banks, do you think there will be any impact on this side of the Tasman?
Well, look, we are taking great interest in the findings of the review for that very reason. We, of course, have a number of Australian-owned banks, so we absolutely need to take an interest in that review, and we will be.
Because Westpac has its government contract, do you think that might be impacted at all?
I think it would be getting ahead of ourselves to say that, but more generally, in principle, I'd say we are interested in the outcomes of that work.
What would you do if similar practices were found here in New Zealand?
I'm not going to run into a hypothetical, but of course, my interest is as well for consumers, and so I'll be taking particular interest in that.
Do you think that the government banking should go through a Kiwi-owned bank?
Oh, that's been raised in the past. There's a number of reasons why that original decision was made, and a number of criteria, of course, that the decision would have been based on. And it's taken at the time under due consideration. I don't think the only thing, though, is who the bank is owned by. It's the ability to carry out the job. But of course, every time it comes up, you take a fresh look.
Do you have what's your gut feeling on it? Do you think?
I would want to make sure that I had every confidence that whoever it was awarded to, A, is in the position to do the job properly and well. But of course, there are a number of factors, and as I say, when it's up for review, you take a fresh look.
Have you been given a date for medical reasons at all that you might have to stop travelling?
I just, as it happens, I actually just got some advice on that today, that I should have no trouble flying right up until the day that I'm due, and that's my intention.
Is that overseas as well?
Overseas, you have to get clearance for every flight, so I had to get clearance to fly to Europe, but that was no trouble.
Are you planning any more overseas trips?
No, and there's nothing on the schedule, but also nothing that I'm necessarily missing as a result either. We've set out an agenda for the year. All of the objectives that I'd like to achieve, by and large, we're going to be able to achieve regardless.
Do you have a last day in mind?
I'm going to work right up until my due date.
Prime Minister?
Well, all things holding equal.
Later on, do you have to get permission to travel when you're close to due date?
No. I understand that the protocol is that when your flight is under 4 hours, if you have one medical certificate after the 36-week mark, that can hold you over for the remaining 4 weeks. So that's what I'll be doing.
And Middleton set quite a high benchmark coming out in public 7 hours after birth. Have you got any plans in mind in that part?
Absolutely not. I have to say, when I saw that photo, I counted back how many hours it had been since she had given birth, and have made sure in all of my interviews since then I have lowered any expectation that I will be doing the same, or that I will look quite as well composed as she did.
Are you expecting a return gift from William and Kate?
No, absolutely not. And I do hope, I genuinely hope, I know that they will be absolutely overwhelmed by gifts from across the globe. But I do hope that ours, makes it through amongst that pack, because I have heard that there is a real love of New Zealand children's books in the family, and equally the blanket that's been sent is particularly special. It's beautiful. I've seen it, and it is handcrafted. And of course the little romper, I'm hoping might get some use. No guarantees.
So Palace has obviously got this the whole baby news thing down pat. Does your office have a baby plan?
No, not really. I'm going to have it, and then we'll go from there.
Prime Minister, you made it really clear last month that you didn't want government departments to be using the security firm Thompson & Clark to be spying on New Zealanders.
Yes.
The Department of Conservation, they're using Thompson & Clark to carry out surveillance on anti-1080 protesters. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I've sought clarification over what it is exactly that Thompson & Clark have been doing for DOC for that very reason. My understanding is that DOC did ask them to monitor threats on social media, but I'd say that's very different from monitoring individuals, and the department, as I understand, have said that they've not asked them to carry out surveillance on individuals, because that would be of concern.
Yeah, the department has said though that if people are making threats, then Thompson and Clark then basically figures out whether they are capable of carrying out those threats, so doesn't that
And that crosses over, I think, into the space that we've really asked the State Services Commission to undertake some work, and for good reason. Questions have been asked over whether or not some of that surveillance at an individual level is going too far. So I would hope that the SEC, if it's relevant to the work that they're doing, would include that. But as I say, monitoring of social media is something that obviously the Department of Conservation has concerns about, because there have been specific threats online to their staff, and they should be concerned about that.
Since you made the call to essentially ban people from using, ban government departments from using Thompson and Clark, have you been
As
informed
private investigators, and that is something that the State Services Commission is still looking into, the breadth of that use. Southern Response was a really good example of where it was stepping into a space that we were really uncomfortable with. But I would want to make sure that if we are seeing that use by other departments, that it is done appropriately.
But you haven't been informed of any other departments that have been using it in the same way as Southern Response?
Not yet, but of course that's why the State Services Commission is doing this piece of work.
Is the government making a distinction between their surveillance work and their security work?
Yeah.
And saying one is valid and the other isn't?
Yeah, well, obviously there are a number of contracts around security work, but I think where there's been real concern is where it's tripping into the space of individual surveillance and the appropriateness of that.
But on their track record, can they be trusted to observe the difference?
I'll await the findings of the State Services Commission before I make that judgment. Okay, anything else?